What would you do if the only home you had ever known was sold out from under you by the woman your father married in his last tired year? Sold not for its worth, but for the pleasure of watching you walk away with nothing. Picture a young woman of 23, turned out of a crumbling estate at Brackenlee with a single trunk and a father's memory, told the deed had passed to strangers before his grave had settled. But what she did not yet know, what her stepmother could not have known, was that her father, careful even in his weakness, had long ago bought other ground in another man's name. Settle in. Stay close. Let the lane and the lamp and the long walk do their work. The cart came down out of the hills at first light, and Lucy Foster sat on its edge with her boots crossed and her hands folded in her lap, as though folded hands might hold a life together. She had left the house at Brackenlee 2 days before, and the leaving was still fresh under her ribs. The carter, a broad man from Ashfold parish who had known her father in better weather, said little. He clucked at the horse and let the road speak. Hedgerows dripped. A crow lifted from a bare ash. The mist thinned enough to show the low sweep of the fields, and Lucy watched them pass the way a person watches a face they will not see again. She had been given a quarter of an hour to gather what was hers. The stepmother, Mrs. Adela Foster, had stood in the hallway in her black bombazine with her rings on her fingers and her mouth pulled tight as a purse string, and she had watched Lucy climb the stairs as though watching a debt collected. The papers were signed. The sale to a merchant out of the north was already drawn. The estate would pass in 6 weeks, and the money with it, and Lucy, being of age and being the daughter of a first wife long buried, had no claim the courts would trouble themselves over. She had taken her mother's shawl. She had taken a small enamel box of pins. She had taken the little Bible her father had used at the end, and inside it, folded twice, a receipt for rent whose meaning she did not yet understand. She had taken nothing more. The cart stopped at the crossroads above Nethercombe, where a lane branched down to the village, and another climbed east toward Wren Hollow. The carter set her trunk down on the wet grass and touched his cap. "Your father was a fair man," he said. "He was," Lucy murmured. "You've somewhere to lie tonight?" "The widow Hensley at Nethercombe," she wrote. He nodded once, slowly, and did not offer more than a nod could carry. Then he climbed back onto the seat and the cart went on, and Lucy stood in the road with her trunk at her feet and the mist thickening again around her shoulders. She did not weep. She had done her weeping in the attic at Brackenlee the night the letter of sale had been read aloud in the drawing-room. What was left in her now was quieter than weeping. It was the small, hard seed of a person who had decided, without yet knowing what the decision would ask of her, that she would not be swept away. She lifted the trunk by its worn leather handle and began to walk down the lane toward the smoke of Nethercombe's chimneys. The widow Hensley kept a narrow house at the end of a row of 4, with a whitewashed front and a step scrubbed pale by 40 years of Sundays. She opened the door before Lucy could knock, took the trunk from her without ceremony, and put a bowl of thin barley soup in front of her at the deal table by the fire. She had been the housekeeper at Brackenlee in Lucy's mother's time, and she remembered a girl of 4 in a pinafore chasing a kitten across the kitchen flags. "You'll bide here," she said, "as long as you need." "I cannot pay you," said Lucy. "I have not asked." For a week Lucy did little but sleep and mend. The widow set her small tasks, quiet ones, sorting buttons, hemming a sheet, plucking a fowl, and Lucy took them gratefully, because idle hands make loud minds, and her mind was loud enough as it was. She did not speak of the estate. She did not speak of Adela. She turned the receipt from her father's Bible over in her fingers at night by the tallow candle, and read the 2 lines of copperplate written across it. Received of J. Marbury, 1 year's rent for the cottage and field at Hollowbeck, sum of £4.6. Signed, T. Foster, 1859. She did not know a J. Marbury. She did not know a cottage at Hollowbeck. Her father had never spoken of either. On the 9th morning she walked into the village to fetch the widow's flour, and outside the corn merchant's she heard her own name spoken from the doorway of the wheelwright's shop, and she paused without meaning to. 2 men were talking. One she did not know. The other was Mr. Peter Havering, the land agent who had acted for her stepmother in the sale. "The foster girl," said the stranger. "Left with anything?" "A trunk," said Havering, and laughed, a small dry laugh, not cruel exactly, only pleased with itself. "And a scrap of paper her father tucked in his Bible, so I hear. An old rent receipt for some tumble-down place at Hollowbeck. She thinks it means something." "Does it?" "Nothing worth the ink. The cottage is half a ruin, the field is thistles, and the name on the deed is not Foster. She'd do better to burn the paper and take a place in service. That land's been dead these 20 years. They laughed together then, a shared, soft laugh of men who knew the shape of the world and did not expect it to surprise them. And Lucy stood very still in the road, with the flour sack held to her chest, and let their words settle inside her, the way a stone settles into still water. Then she walked on, and she did not look at the wheelwright's door as she passed. That night she opened the receipt again by the candle, and read the 2 lines 100th time, and for the first time she did not read them as a mystery. She read them as a beginning. What would drive a young woman with no coin and no name to walk out into wet fields for the sake of a paper others were laughing at? What did her father hide at Hollowbeck, and why in another man's name? If this story has already taken hold of you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Leave a like if you believe in patient women and buried truths, and subscribe so you do not miss what she found when she went out the next morning to see the ruin for herself. Word traveled the way. Word always traveled in Nethercombe, which was to say by the back door of one kitchen into the front door of the next. And by the time Lucy took the widow's basket to the baker's, the following morning, there was scarcely a woman in the row who did not know that the girl from Brackenleigh had come down out of the hills with a trunk and a scrap of paper and a notion. The baker's wife weighed the loaf without meeting her eye. A boy at the pump made a face for the benefit of another boy behind the water butt. 2 women at the pump, kerchiefs knotted tight, quieted as she passed and began again in low voices when she was 3 steps beyond, and Lucy heard the word Hollowbeck fall out of their whispering like a pebble dropped into a tin cup. She did not turn. She had learned in the last month that turning only fed them. She walked on with the basket at her hip and the loaf warm against the linen, and she kept her face plain. At the corner where the lane bent toward the church, a knot of men stood outside the smithy with their hands in their pockets, watching. One of them was Peter Havering. He had come down from the upper village on some errand for Mrs. Adela Foster, or perhaps only to be seen where he could be laughed with. And he lifted his hat to Lucy with a courtesy that was more insult than any bare head could have been. "Miss Foster," he said, "off to inspect the estate." The men behind him snorted into their sleeves. Lucy stopped. She looked at him full, and she said, "Good morning, Mr. Havering." "You'll want stout boots for it," he said, "and a scythe, and a strong stomach." He turned half a shoulder to the smith. "The young lady inherits a thistle field, and a chimney with no house under it. We are all to bow when she passes." The smith did not laugh. The smith only looked at his anvil. But the 2 apprentices laughed, and a farmer waiting for a shoe laughed. And Havering was pleased. "You would do better," he said, more kindly, more terribly, to burn the paper and take a place. Mrs. Foster would speak for you at a good house. A word from her opens doors. Thank you, Lucy said. I have somewhere to go this morning. She walked on. The laughter followed her only as far as the churchyard wall, and then it was cut off by the wind. It was at the lych gate that the elder found her, or that she found the elder, an old man in a threadbare black coat too large for his shoulders, seated on the stone bench inside the gate with his hands folded on the head of a stick. He had been vicar at Nethercombe 40 years before, so the widow had said, and now he was only a man who came out in the mornings to sit where the dead had passed. His eyes were pale and steady. He watched her come. Lucy would have gone by with a bow of the head, for she did not know him, but he lifted his stick a finger's breadth, and she stopped. You are Thomas Foster's girl, he said. His voice was thin and dry and very clear. I am, sir. He looked at her a long moment. Then he said, Your father bought quiet ground. Look for the name he trusted, not the name he wore. Lucy waited for more. There was no more. He inclined his head to her once, as a man inclines his head at a graveside, and set his gaze on the churchyard yew and did not speak again. She said, Thank you, sir, because she did not know what else to say, and she went out through the gate with the words settling in her like the flour dust settling in the widow's kitchen, everywhere, and not yet swept. She did not go back to the widow's for a coat. She had the shawl about her shoulders and her mended boots on her feet, and the day, though grey, was not yet raining. She took the east lane out of Nethercombe, the one that climbed toward Wren Hollow, and where a signpost at a gap in the hedge pointed with a weathered finger to Hollowbeck, she turned north into a track that had not seen a cart in a season. The track ran between two hedgerows grown together over her head. Blackthorn scratched at the shawl. Bramble hooked her hem. In places the ruts were full of standing water skinned with the year's last leaves, and she stepped along the raised center with her skirts gathered in one hand. A magpie called once from the field beyond the hedge, and did not call again. The light was the flat, pewter light of a morning that had not decided whether to be rain or only cold. She walked for the better part of an hour. The land fell away to her left into a shallow combe where a beck ran black between alders, and it was from this beck, she supposed, that the place took its name. Where the hedgerow at last thinned and gave onto open ground, she stopped and looked. There was a wall of dry stone half tumbled, and inside it a field that was more rush than grass. And standing at the far edge of the field with its back to a rise of oak scrub was the cottage. It was low and long, with a slate roof sagging at one end where a rafter had gone, and a chimney of pale local stone still upright at the other. The door was gone. One window on the near side had its frame. The other was only a hole. Around it the ground was tufted and wet, and Havering's word for it, thistles, was fair, for they stood in stiff, dark clumps to the height of a child, dead now with the year, but thick. Lucy stood at the gap in the wall and let the disappointment come, because there was no use pretending it had not. Then she went in. She waded through the wet grass to the doorstep, which was a single flag of hard stone worn hollow in the middle by the feet of people long gone. She stepped over it. Inside was one room and a half, a hearth of blackened stone at the chimney end, a floor of trodden earth, a corner where the roof had held, and a corner where it had not. A fern grew from a crack in the wall. A mouse fled at her boot. The smell was of wet ash and old wood, and faintly, of something sweeter. Apples, perhaps, from a tree gone wild in the yard behind. She did not cry. She stood in the middle of the room with her hands at her sides and let the place look at her. After a while she sat down on the hearthstone. She had brought no bread and no water, thinking to be back in Nethercombe by noon, but noon came and she did not go. She sat, and then she walked the 4 walls, and then she went out to the yard and found the apple tree, bent and mossed and half broken, but with 3 small brown apples still clinging to a low branch, and she picked one and ate it standing. She stayed until the light began to change. She would not sleep here tonight, for she had no covering, and the roof at the chimney end was the only sound roof. And yet she found she could not bear to walk away as if she had only come to look. She gathered dry rush and old bracken from the yard and made a low bed of it in the sound corner. She put her shawl folded upon it. She sat beside it as the gray light thickened toward evening, and she listened. She listened to the beck below the field, running low and steady over stones. She listened to the wind moving in the oak scrub behind the cottage. She listened to a fox bark once, far off, and to the settling of the old timbers as the day cooled. She had lived 23 years within stone walls, and had never before, she thought, listened to a house from inside it as one listens to a person breathing in the next room. At dusk she rose and shook out the shawl and walked back down the track to Nethercombe by the last of the light. And the widow, who had begun to worry, said only, "You have been long," and set a plate before her, and asked no more. That night Lucy lay in the narrow bed under the eaves, and did not sleep for a long time. She thought of the elder's words, "Look for the name he trusted, not the name he wore." She thought of the receipt folded in the Bible, and of the letters J and M in her father's copperplate. She thought of the fern in the wall, and the hollow in the doorstep, and the 3 small brown apples on the broken tree. She did not know yet what she had seen, but she knew she had seen something, and she knew she would go back. She rose before the widow, dressed by the gray window, and eyed a heel of bread standing at the deal table so as not to wake the house. She took the widow's old scrubbing brush from the yard hook, and, from the peg by the door, the small bill hook the widow used on her own hedge, and she folded a clean sacking cloth over her arm. She had asked the night before, and the widow had said only, "Take what you need, and mind the wet stones on the track." The widow's old dog, a lean gray lurcher with one white eye and a stiff hip, rose from the hearth when Lucy took the brush and stood at the door as if the matter were settled. Lucy opened the latch, and he went out ahead of her and waited on the step. She did not send him back. They walked the east lane together in a thin dawn mist. The dog kept to her heel without being told. At the turning to Hollowbeck, he did not hesitate but went on before her up the track, as though he had walked it in another life and remembered the way. Lucy did not question it. She had learned already, in a week of small rooms and small tasks, not to ask a creature what it knew. The field was quieter than the day before. The wind had dropped in the night. When Lucy stepped through the gap in the wall, the dog went to the doorstep of the cottage and lay down across it, chin on the hollowed stone, as if he had been asked to keep it. Lucy began where any woman would begin, at the hearth. She knelt on the trodden earth and took the widow's brush and swept the dead ash and leaf litter out of the fireplace onto the sacking cloth. She swept until the flags at the back of the hearth showed pale under the black, and then she stopped. Because on the underside of the great oak mantel beam, where the smoke had never quite reached because of the way the draft pulled, she saw a mark. It was not a mason's mark. It was a small, clean cut, the size of a thumbnail. 2 letters set close. The way a man cuts his own initial and then his fellow's when the timber is fresh and he is proud of the joint. J and M cut with a proper chisel. The wood around the letters was smoother than the rest of the beam, planed by a joiner who had known his trade. Lucy sat back on her heels and looked at the letters a long time. She did not touch them. She did not scrape at them. She did not go outside and turn over the doorstep or pull up the flags. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood and looked at the beam as one looks at a face one is beginning to recognize. Then she took up the brush and went on with the sweeping, because she was not yet ready to know what she was looking at. And she thought that if she pulled at the thread too soon, the whole of it might fray in her hand. The dog watched her from the doorstep. He did not come in. When she carried the sack of ash out to the yard, he lifted his head and set it down again. When she went past him with the billhook to the field, he followed at a distance and lay in the sun on a dry tuft at the wall. She worked until noon. She did not stop for water because she had brought none. She had come back this time with hands, and the hands were what she had. By evening, she could see what the field wanted to be. She had cut a swath of thistle 6 paces wide from the gap in the wall toward the door, and she had piled the cut stalks against the dry stone. Her palms were blistered along the base of each finger, and one blister had broken and was raw. She rinsed her hands in the beck below the field and walked back to Nethercombe with the dog beside her, and the widow, seeing the state of her hands, took down a jar of goose grease from the shelf and rubbed it into the raw places without speaking and bound them with strips of clean linen. In the morning she went again. She went the morning after that. The widow gave her bread wrapped in a cloth and a stoppered bottle of small beer and said, "You will kill yourself for a thistle field." And Lucy said, "Not for the thistles," and went. The dog rose from the hearth each morning as she took the brush, and each morning he walked ahead of her up the track. She learned the cottage as a woman learns a child. She scrubbed the flags at the sound end of the room until the stone came up a warm honey color under the grime, and she saw that they had been laid true and close by a mason who cared. She pulled the fern from the crack in the wall, and behind it found not the rubble she had expected, but proper coursed stone, well pointed, with lime mortar still holding. She cleared the yard behind the cottage of bracken and nettle and found beneath it the shapes of a kitchen garden. 4 beds edged with set stones, and at the corners 4 fruit trees, gone half wild, but planted in a square by a hand that had meant an orchard. She counted them. A pear at the north corner, 2 apples on the east and west, and at the south, sheltered from the wind by the oak scrub, a plum. None of them had been set by chance. On the 4th day, she came upon the well. It stood in the yard, its mouth stopped with a rotted board, and a great flat stone laid over the board. She could not lift the stone alone and did not try. But when she knelt and put her ear to it, she heard, faint and far, the small, clear sound of water moving. The dog, who had followed her into the yard, sat down beside the stone and pressed his shoulder against her knee, and she rested her hand on the flat of his head. On the 5th day she found, in the ash she had swept from the hearth, and afterwards spread on the vegetable beds, as her father had taught her long ago, a piece of black iron the size of her palm. It was a key. The teeth were worn but distinct. It was not the key of any lock she had yet seen in the cottage, for the door was gone and the shutters were gone, and there was no press and no chest and no cellar door. She washed it in the beck and put it in the pocket of her apron and did not tell the widow. On the 6th day, coming down the track at dusk, she stopped at the crest where the hedgerow opened and looked back at the cottage lying long and low in the failing light. And she saw for the first time that it was not a laborer's hut set down anyhow. It sat square to the wind. Its chimney was on the sheltered end. Its door had faced south. Its orchard was planned. A man had chosen this ground for someone. A man had built here for a life that had never come. She did not yet say to herself whose life. She only walked on, the dog at her heel and the key warm against her hip, and she knew now that she was not clearing a ruin. She was uncovering an intention. On the 7th morning, Lucy did not go straight to the field. She stood a long while at the deal table with the black iron key laid on the boards before her, the receipt folded beside it, and her father's little Bible closed at her elbow. A key was not the shape of a house. A key was the shape of a small thing kept from being lost. She had scrubbed the sound corner. She had swept the hearth. She had put her hand into every crack in the coursed stone she could find. There was one place she had not yet tried, because it had been in front of her every day, and she had taken it, without thinking, for what it seemed. She took the widow's short iron poker from beside the fire, wrapped the head in a strip of rag so it would not scar, and set out with the dog at her heel. The mist lay low in the combe. The beck was louder for the night's rain. At the cottage she went in without stopping at the doorstep, knelt at the hearth, and looked up. The mantel beam ran the width of the fireplace, and above it, in the inner face of the chimney breast, ran a course of pale stone she had not much studied because it stood in shadow. She had chalked the letters J and M in her mind at the underside of the beam. She now saw, in the course directly above, one stone that did not match the rest. It was smaller by a finger's breadth. Its joints were thinner. Its face had been rubbed at the corners, as if by a hand set there in the same place for many years. Lucy laid the poker aside and tried the stone with her fingers first. It gave a little. She fetched the billhook and used the flat of the blade at the joint. The mortar was not lime, but something softer, packed to look like lime, and it came out clean. The stone slid forward the length of a finger, then the length of a hand. She set it down on the hearth. Behind the stone was a shallow niche, cut square, no deeper than her forearm. Inside the niche, wrapped in oilcloth blackened by soot, sat a small flat box of tinned iron with a keyhole on its short side. Lucy did not lift it out at once. She sat back on her heels on the hearthstone and looked at the box in the niche, as if looking at a bird that might yet fly. The dog came in for the first time in a week. He stepped over the doorstep, crossed the room, and lay down against her hip. She rested her hand on his shoulder and felt his breath move under her palm. Then she reached in and lifted the box out into the light of the open door. It was heavier than it looked. The oilcloth peeled away in strips. The tin had held. She set the box on the hearthstone, took the black iron key from her apron pocket, and fitted it. It went in true. It turned with a small dry sound like a beetle in dry grass. The lid lifted on a hinge stiff with disuse. Inside, papers, folded flat. Wrapped again, more finely, in a square of oiled silk. Lucy did not tear at them. She lifted the packet out and laid it on her lap and unfolded the silk. The first paper was thick, official, sealed at the foot with red wax gone brittle. She turned it toward the door for the light. It was a deed of purchase, drawn in a solicitor's hand, dated the 3rd of April, 1859, whereby one John Marbury of Wren Hollow in the parish of Ashfold acquired of the previous owner the cottage and enclosed field at Hollowbeck, together with the strip of beckside and 6 acres of hill pasture above, for the sum of £112 paid in full. Lucy read it twice. Her hands did not shake, but her breath had gone shallow. She set the deed aside on the hearthstone and unfolded the second paper. It was in her father's hand. She would have known the hand in the dark. The letters leaned as they always had, small and firm, the tail of the Y turned like a small hook. It was a plain declaration, drawn without a solicitor, and it was witnessed at the foot by 2 names. One she did not know, and one she did. Old Mr. Ainsley of Ashfold, dead these 6 years, who had been her father's oldest friend. The declaration said, in 8 lines, that the purchase money for the cottage and field and pasture at Hollowbeck had been paid out of Thomas Foster's own purse, and that John Marbury held the said property in trust, in his name and under his hand, for Lucy Foster, only child of Thomas Foster by his first wife, born the 14th of October, 1848, to come to her at her majority or at her father's death, whichever should be later. It was dated the same month as the deed. It was signed in full. Lucy set the paper down on the hearthstone beside the deed, and for a long moment she did not move. There was a third paper, thinner, folded smaller. She opened it last. It was a page torn from a household almanac, and on it, in her father's hand, a short list of the years. 1859, 1860, 1861, and so on down to 1868, and against each year the entry, received of J.M. rent, £4 6 shillings. The last entry was in the year before he sickened. He had kept the rents. He had accounted for them. He had let it be known between himself and Marbury that the ground was held, and held for her. Lucy folded the papers again into the oiled silk, laid them in the tin, laid the tin in her lap, and put her arms around it as if it were a child. The dog pressed his head against her side. Outside, the sun climbed a little higher and put a bar of pale light across the trodden floor. She did not cry. She sat with the box for the length of an hour, and in that hour she said aloud, only once in the empty cottage, "He meant it for me." The dog thumped his tail on the earth. The apple tree in the yard behind moved in a small wind. She did not need to say it twice. When she rose, she wrapped the tin in the sacking cloth, laid the loose stone back into its place in the chimney breast, and pressed a little damp earth from the yard into the joint to hide the pale line where the mortar had come away. She carried the tin under her arm down the track and did not stop until she reached the widow's door. That night, when the widow had gone up, Lucy laid the deed and the declaration and the almanac page on the deal table by the tallow candle, and she looked at them for a long time, as if to be sure they had not changed shape while her back was turned. They had not. She wrapped them again, put them into the little Bible with the receipt, put the Bible into her trunk, and turned the key. The black iron key of the tin she kept in her apron pocket. She slept that night without dreaming, for the first time since she had come down out of the hills. The wind rose in the small hours. By dawn, it had become a wind that took slates off houses. By mid-morning, it was a gale, and the sky over Nethercombe had gone the color of pewter, and the widow stood at her step and looked up the lane and said, "This will be 3 days." She was not often wrong about weather. Lucy stood at the widow's window with her hand on the sill and looked east toward Hollowbeck. She thought of the sagging end of the roof, of the bracken bed in the sound corner, of the apple tree half broken already, of the flat stone over the well. She thought also of the letters in the tin under the linen in her trunk, and of the 6 weeks that had been named for the sale of Brackenlee, of which perhaps 4 now remained. "I must go up," she said. The widow turned from the fire. "In this, before it worsens, there is a woman at the holding above the beck, Mrs. Prowse, that was. With the child. With the child, and no man there since Michaelmas." The widow looked at her a long moment, then nodded once, and went to the press for a stouter shawl and an oilskin that had been her husband's. She wrapped a loaf and a lump of cheese and a bottle of small beer in a cloth. She did not try to keep Lucy home. Lucy went out into the wind with the dog beside her and the oilskin over the widow's shawl and the bundle under her arm. The track to Hollowbeck ran east into the weather. Twice she had to turn her back to the wind to draw breath. The hedgerows lashed. A rook came down the wind sideways and was gone before she had seen it whole. At the turning to the Prowse holding, half a mile short of Hollowbeck, she left the track and crossed a wet field to the low stone house set against the shoulder of the hill. The thatch on the north pitch had begun to lift. Mrs. Prowse, a thin woman of perhaps 30, was in the yard trying to weight it with a hurdle and stones, and doing it badly with a child of 4 wailing at her skirts. When she saw Lucy, she stood up and put a hand to her back. "It will not hold another hour," Lucy said. "I know it. Come with me. To Hollowbeck. The sound corner will keep off rain, and I have bread." Mrs. Prowse looked at the child. The child looked at the dog. The dog sat down on the wet grass and thumped his tail once. That decided it. They tied what they could into a bundle, a blanket, a pot, the child's other boot, and left the thatch to the wind. Lucy took the child up on her hip. The child weighed less than she had feared. They came up the track to Hollowbeck with the gale at their shoulders, and Lucy pushed open the empty doorway and brought them into the room she had scrubbed to honey-colored stone, and set the child down in the sound corner on the folded shawl and the bracken. They stayed there through the storm. The wind took the last of the far rafters in the small hours of the first night. The slate came down inside the ruined end with a noise that made the child cry and the dog stand. Lucy held the child against her shoulder and watched the sound corner hold. The chimney above them did not shift. The coursed stone above the mantel beam did not shift. The stone in which the tin had been hidden did not shift. She thought, kneeling there, of a man who had chosen this ground for the wind that came down this combe, and of what he had built to stand against it, and she felt no fear. On the second day the rain came sideways in sheets. Lucy went out into the yard and cut green ash from the scrub and dragged it up over the doorway to break the weather. She lit a small fire in the hearth from the driest wood she could find in the ruined end. The chimney drew as if it had been swept the week before. She heated water in Mrs. Prowse's pot. She broke the loaf into 4 and gave 3 parts to the child and Mrs. Prowse. She gave a crust to the dog. She ate the last herself, standing at the hearth. On the third day the wind fell. The rain went to mist. By afternoon there was a pale, watery sun over the oak scrub, and the beck below the field ran brown and fast and loud. Mrs. Prowse sat on the hearthstone with the child asleep across her lap, and looked around at the honey flags and the swept fire and the fern-cleared wall, and she said, "This was a good house once." "It will be again," Lucy said. She did not say it loudly. She said it as one says the time of day. Mrs. Prowse looked at her then in a way she had not looked at her before, and did not answer. That evening, Lucy walked down the track to Nethercombe to fetch more bread, and at the crest where the hedgerow opened, she stopped and looked back at the cottage. Smoke was going up from the chimney straight into the still air. A light showed in the doorway, where she had left a tallow end burning in a saucer for Mrs. Prowse. The field lay dark and wet around it. It looked from the crest like a house with people in it. Lucy went on down the track. She had decided, without saying it to herself in words, 3 things. She would not go back to sleeping under the widow's eaves as a lodger who might one day be a burden. She would take her papers, before the 6 weeks were out, to a man in a black coat who would know what to do with them. And she would not let Mrs. Prowse and the child, having once come under that roof out of the weather, go back to a thatch that would not hold. What her father had meant for her, she had been given. What she had, she would hold open. She walked into the widow's kitchen with the wind still in her hair, and said, "I shall want the loan of the cart tomorrow, and the name of an honest solicitor." The widow looked up from the fire. She did not ask why. She said, "Tomorrow you shall have both." By first light, the widow's neighbor had brought round his cart, a low box on iron wheels with a patient bay mare between the shafts, and the widow had written on a slip of paper the name of Mr. Halstead, solicitor, of the Market Square at Ashfold, who had done her husband's small business honestly, and who had known Thomas Foster in the years before his marriage to Mrs. Adela. Lucy took the little Bible from her trunk, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and set it in a covered basket on the seat beside her. The black iron key rode in her apron pocket. The dog rode at her feet. She drove out of Nethercombe by the upper lane, past the smithy where two apprentices stood in the doorway and did not laugh this time, past the wheelwright's shop where Peter Havering was not to be seen, and up the long, slow road to Ashfold Market Square. Mr. Halstead was a spare man of 60 with clean hands and a black coat gone grey at the elbows. He read the deed first, then the declaration, then the almanac page, and then read all three again in the same order. He set them down flat on his desk and rested his palm on them as one rests a palm on the flank of a good horse. "Miss Foster," he said, "your father was a careful man. He said the trust was plain, that John Marbury of Wend Hollow was living and known to him, that the property was not part of Bracken Lee and could not be touched by the sale to the merchant from the north, and that the 6 weeks did not concern Hollowbeck at all. He said he would write that afternoon to Mr. Marbury and to the merchant's own solicitor, and that Lucy might sleep easy on the matter of the cottage and the field and the beckside and the 6 acres of hill pasture. He said it quietly, as one gives the weather to a neighbor. He said one thing more. He said that a declaration of trust so plainly witnessed, joined to a deed and to 8 years of rent entries in the truster's own hand, was in his long practice as clear a case as he had seen brought into his room. He said this without heat and without smiling. Lucy paid him 3 shillings from the small purse the widow had pressed on her, which was all he would take that day, and drove home by the lower road. In the following week, the news went about Nethercombe and Ashfold in the slow way that news went about those parishes then. From the solicitor's clerk to the corn merchant, from the corn merchant to the baker's wife, from the baker's wife to the pump. John Marbury himself came down from Wend Hollow on a Tuesday in a clean coat, and shook Lucy's hand at the widow's door and said, "Your father set it in my keeping. I have kept it. It is yours." He stayed for a cup of tea, and told her plainly what fields lay in the 6 acres, where the boundaries ran, and where the old drain had been cut in his grandfather's time. He did not stay long. When he left, he touched his hat to the widow as well. Mrs. Adela Foster came down once in the closed carriage, and stopped it in the lane by the widow's door. She did not get out. She sent Peter Havering to knock. Lucy came to the step. Havering said Mrs. Foster wished her well and hoped there was no ill feeling. He did not lift his hat this time. He held it in both hands. Lucy said, "Please tell Mrs. Foster I am well." She said nothing further. The carriage went on. Havering was seen a fortnight later on the Ashfold road, on foot, carrying his own bag. The sale of Bracken Lee went through to the merchant from the north on the day it had been set to, and Lucy did not go up to see it, and no one asked her to. The baker's wife weighed the loaf now and looked at her, and asked after the cottage roof. The women at the pump made room. The old smith, meeting her at the Lich Gate one Sunday, said only, "Your father's girl," and nodded once. The elder in the threadbare black coat was not at the bench that Sunday, having died quietly in his chair the week before, and Lucy went into the church and sat through the service in the pew he had used. and afterwards laid her hand on the stone bench in the lich gate as she went by. Mrs. Prowse did not go back to the failing thatch. Her holding above the beck was let go to the landlord in exchange for the last quarter's rent, and she and the child kept the sound corner at Hollowbeck, while Lucy and John Marbury and 2 men from Ashfold set new rafters at the ruined end. The flat stone over the well was lifted, and the water underneath was found clean and cold. The widow's dog went between the widow's hearth and the Hollowbeck hearth as he pleased, and slept where he chose. By the end of that season, the roof was whole. The door was hung. The shutters were on. The 4 fruit trees had been pruned back to living wood, and the field was cut and turned. Lucy walked its boundary at evening with the deed folded in her apron and the black iron key in her pocket, and she knew every stone of the wall by the feel of it against her palm. On a still evening in the first cold week of autumn, Lucy stood in the yard at Hollowbeck, at the hour when the low sun laid a warm hand along the pale stone of the chimney and turned the slates the color of a fox's back. The pear at the north corner had dropped its last fruit into the grass. The child was inside asleep on the settle. Mrs. Prowse was at the hearth. The dog lay across the doorstep with his chin on the hollowed stone. John Marbury had gone home to Wren Hollow with a jar of the widow's honey under his arm. From the crest above, the cottage looked, as it had looked to Lucy on the night of the storm, like a house with people in it. She thought of Bracken Lee, sold and shuttered on the far hill, and felt no bitterness toward it. Only the small, clean sorrow one feels for a place that was once a home and is now a house. She thought of her father, who had bought quiet ground in another man's name and left the key to it, folded inside a Bible for a daughter he trusted to find it. She thought of what she had been called, and what she had been sold from, and what she had, in the end, been given back. Mrs. Prowse came to the door and asked what she was looking at. Lucy said, "I did not inherit a house. I inherited being trusted." She said it as she had said the other thing, as one says the time of day. Then she came in out of the cool air and shut the door behind her, and the light went slowly off the chimney and the slates, and the smoke went up straight into the darkening sky. Thank you for staying to the end of Lucy's long walk home, for sitting with her through the loss, the mockery, the labor, and the quiet setting right of what her father had meant her to have. If this story of patience rewarded moved you, do leave a kind word below, share where you are watching from, and follow along, for another life quietly restored is waiting in the next telling.